Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to take the narrative further that possibly little 5-year-old Summer Wells was impaired in some way, perhaps even beyond violence on the home front. Perhaps there was something else that was causing an impairment in this little girl. And once again, we're trying to investigate this idea that there were certain excesses playing out at Chalet Wells. Well, just how extreme were these excesses? Right now we're on day 58 since 5-year-old Summer Wells disappeared, and in this episode we're going to go into a potentially disturbing diagnosis. We've heard from Robin Lane that Summer didn't speak much and that she was mostly non-verbal. And one of the classic symptoms of fetal alcohol syndrome are, you guessed it, speech and language delays. So essentially what we want to do in this episode is investigate, research, educate ourselves on the potential that there was fetal alcohol syndrome present in this case, which is basically that when Summer's mother was pregnant with her, alcohol was consumed, and that this may have had a damaging effect on her brain. It may have caused permanent underlying problems, even a disorder. And I think the story so far of the Summer Wells case has been, we find out something that is quite disturbing, and then we've got to ask the question,
what more than that?
Before we get to today's episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. You can click on the light blue icon on the bottom right of your screen, hit the notifications bell, like, share, leave a comment. If comments are disabled, and I don't disable them, head on to Twitter using the hashtag SummerWells. And let's get started. So it's quite interesting, Don Wells' Facebook account right now, there seems to be quite a lot of anger there, quite a lot of lashing out. But what I think is also interesting is at the same time, there's been zero activity on Candace's Facebook account, and of course nothing on Grandma's as well. So it seems as though, I don't know whether they have volunteered to say nothing or whether they are under instructions to say nothing. And I don't mean from an attorney. Meanwhile, Don is taking control. Don is lashing out. Don is dealing with things, putting out fires. And the thing that I think is truly tragic about this story playing out in Tennessee, is that it's a kind of we're just getting a glimpse into the troubles that have troubled the Wells family. They actually go back a really long time, and it's not just one or two individuals. But almost everyone has had some serious troubles in their life, if not everybody. And so in other words, it's intergenerational, and one wonders, how can you put a stop to the cycle? And I would offer one suggestion: stop drinking alcohol. Maybe easier said than done, but how about that? Because one of the key ways that this cycle does repeat itself is potentially through fetal alcohol syndrome, and I'm going to take you through how that could happen here. So I get the sense that fetal alcohol syndrome inherited by a mother is something that Candace may well have inherited from her own mother, and who knows, perhaps Grandma inherited that from her mother, right? So if you took alcohol out of the whole equation, who knows how things could suddenly just sharpen and strengthen and improve. If you just took that one substance completely out of the equation, who knows how the tissues and the brains and the bodies of these people would have been shaped better, and their prospects, they would be born with aptitudes that would set them up for success rather than for failure. One just wonders, is that an oversimplification? Perhaps it is. Or is it as simple as that? But if it is as simple as that, then what you're seeing is something that compounds every successive generation. It's almost like a photocopy machine where there's an error in the copying process, And as you copy further and further, that error gets compounded. Do you get what I'm saying? You get a sense that in the same way most ordinary people breathe air for most of our lives, some of these folks exist day to day on substances. Again, I understand and I appreciate that you might say, you have no idea what these people are going through, what hell they are going through. And, alcohol provides something that soothes that, the daily prick and scratch of everyday life, right? On the other hand, is there a cost to all of these toxins swilling around for years, for a lifetime, through the good times and bad? Well, isn't the cost that it messes with the reproductive process, causing lifelong impairments? If it's going to soothe you after a hard day's work, well, what about all of the troubles that arise in someone's lifetime that is born into this situation? Perhaps where a mother has low impulse control and drinks at some point during pregnancy. And I think that must be very difficult to go for 9 months without a single drink. According to a peer-reviewed scientific paper published in the National Library of Medicine, the following conclusions were found based on research into verbal and non-verbal fluency in children with heavy prenatal alcohol exposure. And this is a quote from the conclusions. Quote, "This study adds to the literature of the integrity of executive functions in children with heavy prenatal alcohol exposure, documenting fluency impairment in both verbal and nonverbal domains. It is important to note that these impairments were demonstrated in higher functioning alcohol-exposed children, both with and without FAS." That's fetal alcohol syndrome. And that diagnostic group explains such deficiencies above and beyond general intellectual ability, end quote. One of the things that I think can happen with this excessive exposure to alcohol when the baby's in utero is that it can actually lower intelligence. And besides that, lowering this ability to communicate effectively. And so in a situation where you have a 5-year-old child and perhaps a 5-year-old child swimming, and you have this idea that she may be impaired in certain ways, I'm not saying significantly impaired, but maybe slightly impaired, maybe she's also not as communicative as a normal child. And so it might be normal for those around her not to hear her, if I can put it that way. In other words, not to hear her calling out or chattering or saying stuff just because she was to some extent nonverbal. And what that means then, if that was the case, was that the responsibility would be even greater. What I'm trying to say is, if you are the parent or the guardian or the custodian, the carer, the babysitter of a vulnerable young child in your care that has some kind of disorder, disability, impairment, then you've got to pay even more attention to them, right? It's similar but almost to saying, a older child with an impairment is almost equal to a much younger child just in terms of vulnerability. Does that make sense? So there are a couple of nurses on my Patreon channel, and those with experience in FAS have kind of expressed some of their thoughts on it. I'd be really interested to know about yours as well, those of you on YouTube. If comments are disabled, if there are any nurses here who've had experience with it, it would be good to get your assessment. I'm obviously not an expert, and so you really want to get people who have got experience with other people who have this disorder. Is there a communication problem? If you look at Candace, would you say that there might be a communication problem there? Would you say there might be an impairment there? But just in general, people in that sort of situation, and one's got to have compassion for them. They are living a different life to us. Candace seems to have transcended it. She calls it the hillbilly life, and maybe she enjoys it. but it's certainly not something that anyone could deal with, without difficulty, I think. So another thing is, if someone was impaired in her ability to explain certain things, if she was just someone who couldn't really talk freely and naturally. And once again, I think Robin would probably be able to explain this based on her interactions. But if there was a fairly significant impairment, then who knows, is it possible that someone close to her might have seen this as an opportunity for certain types of abuse which he could necessarily get away with. Now, I have heard some people speculating that somebody didn't want someone to go to school because secrets could have been let out. I know where that line of thinking is going, but I'm not sure I really buy it, just because someone was going to Sabbath school. So, if that was the case, you wouldn't have taken her to Sabbath school. But it does make one wonder, was there some kind of way of exerting control if that was the case? Then there's also a Canadian resource dealing with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, that's FASD. And I'll put a link to this in the description. I think it's from a separate page, a Wikipedia page, but the Canadian resource describes, quote, difficulties with expressive language and memory. Children with FASD often have difficulty telling you what they are feeling. Isn't that sad? Isn't that sad to be sort of born into this situation where you aren't able to voice how you're feeling in a situation where it has got to feel excruciating. All the things you're dealing with, all those slings and arrows are so much harder than, folks in the suburbs. And with all of that going on, you have the additional difficulty that you actually can't give a voice to it. You can't express to it. You can't express it. So besides that, I think it's also possible that if Summer was impaired in other ways, and possibly her free-spirited wandering around in church wasn't quite as free-spirited as it appears, maybe it was actually a sign of some deficiency. It's a question I'm asking. I'm not saying that that's definitely the case. Was it the case? That's the question. If we take this idea further, then it might mean that swimming unsupervised, even for a short period, could lead to serious problems simply because someone might have difficulties in orienting herself or not being able to call out if she was in trouble. Perhaps there are some more than superficial similarities here to the Nora Corrin case. I've written a book about that. I'll put a link in the description to that if you're interested. It's called Not All Who Wander Are Lost. It's pretty well reviewed. According to an article published in the U.S. National Library of Medicine titled Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders, Neuropsychological and Behavioral Features, quote, one of the most common neurocognitive findings among those exposed to alcohol during pregnancy is diminished intellectual capacity. I really want to emphasize that, right? Diminished intellectual capacity. The majority of individuals diagnosed with FAS are not intellectually disabled, which means, well, that's defined as an overall IQ score of under 70. But there's nevertheless, they're talking about an intellectual disability that could be present. It might just be mental retardation, right? It might not necessarily be, being mentally disabled, which is defined as below an IQ of 70, but somewhat retarded, right? Just some of that intellectual capacity has been impaired. Do you get what I'm saying? I think another aspect to consider is the possibility of if someone did have some kind of underlying disorder that did actually require medical treatment, that required some kind of medical intervention, which I think Gannon Stork needed something like that. I think he needed something was it ADHD or something? But if Summer was actually regarded as burdensome, not only in terms of her behavior, but in terms of her upkeep. What impact could that have had on, on how she was brought up and how she was treated? So ordinarily, this might not be a big deal, but to a very impoverished family where there are 3 other children and limited resources, perhaps it was a big deal.
What more than that?
So one registered nurse that has been involved in the health insurance side for several years communicated to me, thanks a lot, Lisa, and just asked, did Candice receive prenatal care? Did she abstain from alcohol and drugs while pregnant? I mean, that's the other aspect as well. There's fetal alcohol syndrome, but you could also have drugs that play a factor here. And she said that, she's not sure whether fetal alcohol syndrome is a factor here or a major factor, but there could also be other things going on, autism, ADHD, cognitive delay, meaning no stimulation, poor nutrition, and then there are also social determinants of health, income, where money is spent. Follow the money. What is the money not spent on? Look at the type of housing and the safety, the available food, and the available utilized health services. When a child was ill, what happened? How were they treated? How well is the child sleeping? And so I think part of a proper investigation is asking the right questions. At this point, we may not know the answers, and we may not know them in detail and be very accurate about them, but I think it is important to start asking the right questions. In the next episode, dealing with the Summer Wells case, I'm going to share what I think happened to Summer at the swimming holes. I'm going to provide you with a illustration, quite an in-depth illustration, to show you exactly how I think things played out. And the people who I've already discussed it with have been quite shocked and quite surprised, and I think the illustration resonated with them, that it's very possible, and I think quite probable. So I'm not going to take it further than that at this point. Wherever you are in the world, stay safe, and I'll see you guys next time.